In the middle of the 18th century, two European powers, Great Britain and France, contested ownership of the vast inner basin of North America. The resulting conflict became known in America as the French and Indian War, which developed into a global struggle for the empire, later called the 7 Years' War.
The French-Indian War is very significant in the 18th century. It changed the face of North America. It was a war involving the French and their native allies against the British and the American colonists. At the end of it, France lost its holdings in North America. The French-Indian War is one phase of a global struggle that took place literally on every continent and on every ocean. The French and the British started the war here in southwestern Pennsylvania, but soon it spread around the world.
In 1758, British Secretary of State William Pitt assigned to John Forbes, a Scottish brigadier general in America, the task of securing the backcountry, which meant seizing Fort Duquesne, the French post at the forks of the Ohio River. A deliberate, careful march across hostile territory was advised, consolidating advances by building posts and supply depots. Forbes opened a new road and constructed a chain of forts. The final post and most elaborate fortifications undertaken in the Forbes expedition was Fort Ligonier, known as the post at Loyalhanna. By late October 1758, Virginia Colonel George Washington had arrived at Loyalhanna, but not before the defense of the unfinished Fort Ligonier from enemy attack on October 12th. In a 4-hour engagement, 1,500 British and Americans were confronted by a French Native American force of nearly 600 from Fort Duquesne, who could be driven away only by artillery fire.
French units and some Indian allies attacked the fort, and they made a very strong attack. And had the French taken that fort in October, the rest of the campaign would not have been a success. And with winter coming on, it would have been impossible to take Fort Duquesne before the end of the year. So it was really very crucial, that the fort had been pretty well completed by the 12th of October, and the British forces here at the fort were able to repulse the French, and they did not take the fort. So it was very critical.
Forbes arrived on November 2nd and reluctantly decided to winter his army at Loyalhanna before proceeding to the Forks. On November 12th, however, following a friendly fire incident that almost killed Washington, a captive revealed the weak state of Fort Duquesne. Forbes then countermanded his earlier order and advanced on the Forks, only to find that Fort Duquesne was burned and abandoned on November 24th. Victorious the next day, Forbes occupied the site which he called Pittsburgh, after William Pitt, and he renamed Loyalhanna Ligonier, after Sir John Ligonier, Commander-in-Chief of Land Forces in Great Britain.
The victory at Fort Duquesne, which came about because of the building of Fort Ligonier, made sure for the British that the Indian alliance with the French was broken. So by winning in Pennsylvania, the British could then concentrate their efforts north. In 1759, they could conquer Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, and then decisively they took the city of Quebec, the capital of New France. The following year, they took Montreal. This meant the war would be won by the British, but it was important that Fort Duquesne be captured and that this alliance be broken. George Washington became disenchanted with the British during the French-Indian War for several reasons. First one is, George Washington, then in his 20s, wanted to be a British officer. It was his great goal. Unfortunately for Washington, but fortunately for the future of the United States, the British never offered him a commission. That was one thing. The other is, some of the British officers that he served under were rather condescending toward mere Americans or provincials. He resented that. So from Washington's standpoint, he felt they did not treat the Americans properly.
Rebuilt on its original site, Fort Ligonier welcomes thousands of visitors each year to tour the museum galleries, see the 18th century artillery pieces and wagons, and explore the fort buildings and historic grounds. Journey back to the 18th century to the time of young George Washington. A critical post during the French and Indian War, Fort Ligonier is a premier historic site in western Pennsylvania.
Fort Ligonier is not just for history buffs. Families of all ages with young children enjoy touring Fort Ligonier. It is the most impressive one of the most impressive historic sites in the Laurel Highlands and in the United States. It's very hands-on. It's not everything is behind glass walls. The families, visitors can hike up the hill, look into the buildings where George Washington actually was with his troops, climb down into the powder magazine underground. I did that as a child and loved it. There really is something for everyone, whether you love history, art, culture, even the outdoors, just to climb up the hill at the fort and look at the view and look around and imagine what life was like for George Washington and his troops back in the 1700s.
Explore the remarkable Fort Ligonier Museum exhibits, including The World Ablaze with an original redcoat uniform. See the George Washington collection and appreciate the art gallery of period paintings. Trek through the restored fort on its original 1758 site. Visit the 10 interpreted buildings and Fascine Cannon Battery, and view the largest assemblage of reproduced British 18th century artillery, wagons, and carts anywhere.
The French and Indian War was extremely important to George Washington's military education and his ability to, later on in life, lead the Revolutionary War Army. He learned a great deal during that campaign, and when you study his history, one realizes that this young man, between the ages of 21 and 26, came to Western Pennsylvania 4 times, and it was the only military experience that he had had at all before he was called upon by the Congress in Philadelphia to take command of the Revolutionary Army in Boston.
Fort Ligonier has a George Washington collection. It's very small, but very important. There are 3 significant items. First of all, we have a portrait of Washington in his uniform from the French-Indian War, painted by Rembrandt Peale, the son of Charles Willson Peale. We also have the only autobiography he ever wrote. We have the original copy of one that he did, which was very short, 11 pages, and that tells the story of George Washington in this war. In this document, he finally lets his hair down and really speaks quite honestly about what occurred during that conflict. Finally, but I think perhaps most importantly in terms of public interest, we have the pistols of George Washington. 5. So those 3 objects make up a unique George Washington collection.
Another important part and draw for Fort Ligonier is its wonderful educational programs. Children from kindergarten age through high school and college can participate in educational programming here at the fort. They can not only learn about history, but the arts, culture in this spectacular setting. I encourage anyone who happens to be driving past the fort or is already coming to the Laurel Highlands for another one of our signature attractions to stop at Fort Ligonier. It will far exceed your expectations.
Enjoy the unique Fort Ligonier adventure and the excitement of our colonial heritage during the epic period of the clash for empire between Britain and France. For more information, visit fortligonier.org.